Good day. The last couple of hours in the conflict in Ukraine have been somewhat quieter in terms of their drama than some of the previous day has been, though quite a lot nonetheless has been happening. Though, as I'm going to discuss later in this program, the two big events in geopolitical terms today are the elections in Turkey and Thailand. I'm going to turn to those, at least to the elections in Turkey, later in this program. I'm less familiar, in fact, very unfamiliar with the political situation in Thailand, and I'm going to refer people who are interested in the situation in Thailand to the program that Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has done about this topic. Brian actually lives in Thailand. He's familiar with the politics of the country in ways in which I am not. And you can get a much better and sounder and clearer idea of what's actually happened there than I can provide. But I will touch on it very briefly later in this program. But firstly, let's talk about that perennial topic, the situation on the battlegrounds in Ukraine, as turned out yesterday and over the last couple of hours, and what exactly is happening. Well, always it's difficult to get a complete picture, but the best information, in my opinion, continues to be provided about Bakhmut. We have the most detailed information about what is going on there. It's the battle which has consumed the interests of commentators and reporters from both sides. As I've discussed many times, we have the extraordinary personality of Yevgeny Prigozhin providing us with a running commentary about events. And in fact, we have also some very astute commentators, and I'm going to again express my debt now to Mikael Valtersen, who provide us with a good, up-to-date commentary and analysis about what is happening on the battlefronts, on the battle in and around Bakhmut. Now, yesterday I discussed reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense that there's been intense Ukrainian attacks in and around Bakhmut as the Ukrainians tried to push through Russian defenses on the flanks. And of course, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that these attacks were unsuccessful, that the Ukrainians suffered extremely heavy losses, though they did admit that two senior officers, two colonels, one the colonel of a Russian motorized rifle brigade, the other, from what I can understand, a colonel from a more senior headquarters who'd been sent to the scene to see what was happening. Two of these colonels were killed. Colonel Makarov, who was the brigade commander, and Colonel Boykov, both of whom the Russian Ministry of Defense told us died heroically, leading their men into battle. Well, over the last couple of hours, we've had a little bit more information about what actually did happen over the course of the fighting, and it seems to me that it's now largely confirmed that most of this fighting took place yesterday. I was uncertain as to the exact timing of the fighting that the Russian Ministry of Defense was reporting. It said over the previous 24 hours, which could mean any period of time within a 24-hour period. But it seems that most of the fighting took place over the course of yesterday. And it is clear that there were major Ukrainian attacks, both on the northern flank, near the Khromovo Road and all that area that we've talked about so often, and in the south near Ivanivska. Now, the attack in the north perhaps from a Russian point of view, the more dangerous attack was, it seems, entirely repelled. The Ukrainians made no progress there at all. They were pushed back. They appear to have suffered heavy losses. This isn't just the Russians saying this, or rather, it's not the Russian Ministry of Defense saying this. We now have eyewitness reports, admittedly, almost entirely from Russian sources, but they do seem to confirm that this attack in the north was completely unsuccessful. And I should say that there's been some uncertainty as to which Russian forces dealt with this attack, but it looks as if some Wagner organization troops were located there. But it also seems to be the case, and Yevgeny Prigozhin appears to have acknowledged the fact, that there were regular Russian army formations involved as well, and that they did play an important part in repelling the attack in the north. Now, in the south, around Ivanivska, the attack that took place there, the Ukrainian attack that took place there, was led, or at least was conducted, by the reconstituted Azov regiment. Ukraine has rebuilt this regiment. It's given it an entirely different name, by the way, presumably to further distance it from its well-known ideological and political affiliations. But anyway, there we go. It has been rebuilt. It contains many of the same highly motivated men who served in the original Azov battalion. They have ample military experience. It is considered to be one of Ukraine's elite units. And this force collided with a Russian brigade, apparently the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade. And there was a very intense fight. And it was over the course of this fight that the two colonels identified as killed by the Russian Defense Ministry. It was over the course of that fight that those two colonels were killed. Now, there are some reports that there was a Ukrainian missile or artillery strike on the village of Kleshayevka, which is a bit further to the east, and where the brigade, the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade headquarters is located. And supposedly, the entire headquarters of this brigade was destroyed over the course of that strike. And Mikhail Valterson says that actually 3 colonels might have been killed over the course of this fighting, though, as I said, we have only been told by Russian sources about 2 of them. Anyway, one thing everybody concedes is that the Azov regiment did gain some ground, not perhaps very much, not perhaps ground of any great or specific importance, but they were able to clear a wooded plantation, a sort of forest plantation that there was in this area. But it is nonetheless acknowledged that they didn't achieve any breakthroughs. So the Russian Defense Ministry's account that the attack was repelled largely is true for this part of the fighting front as well. But the Russian Ministry of Defense didn't make it clear that there was a pullback, though perhaps not a very significant one. Well, that at least is what the commentaries that I've been seeing from various people have been suggesting today. Now, having said that, Mikhail Valterson suggests, and I'm sure he's right, that after a fight of this intensity, the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian army, well, he says it's exhausted. It's certainly taken a severe blow, and he suggests that it needs to be relieved and that these troops need to be replaced by fresher troops. And I've no reason to doubt that. I'm sure that that is correct. But nonetheless, and overall, no Ukrainian breakthrough yesterday on the flanks, despite a major Ukrainian effort to achieve that breakthrough. Now, if you assume that the reports of the Russian Defense Ministry are true, if you accept their numbers for Ukrainian casualties, then it seems that in these attacks that have been taking place on the flanks of Bakhmut over the last week or so, the Ukrainians have lost, I say lost, I mean dead and wounded, something like 2,500 men, without capturing any important or significant ground or changing the overall picture. In fact, there are some reports, which again I want to stress, I cannot corroborate, that in some places on the flanks, the Russians actually have been on the attack. So there's a report, which may be true, may not be true, I don't know, that there was another Russian attack, for example, in the north, towards Orekhovo-Vasilyevka village, which is somewhere, as I said, in the northern area, some distance actually from the latest fighting near the Khromovo road. And there's even a suggestion that further south, away from the Ivanivska area, there was also a Russian attack. But I want to stress these are uncorroborated reports, at least uncorroborated as far as I can see. And I don't suppose or think that they were attacks of any significance. But certainly there doesn't seem to have been any Ukrainian breakthrough. The Ukrainians seem to have suffered significant losses, but they haven't broken through. Now, that leaves open the question of what exactly the Ukrainians are going to do next. And today, Reuters provided a report about comments about the progress or state of the Ukrainian counterattack from the Ukrainian Ground Forces Commander, General Zelensky, and Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister. Now, I'm going to say, perhaps one shouldn't read too much into the statements of these officials, but my overall sense was that they weren't talking up the events around Bakhmut very much, that they were providing a rather somber picture of the situation overall. The Deputy Defense Minister spoke about how the Russians have their plan to encircle Bakhmut has been foiled. She spoke about the fact that the situation in Bakhmut itself was extremely difficult. Zelensky talked about the fact that the Ukrainian forces were outmatched in terms of numbers by the Russians in this area. It didn't seem to be the sort of comments one would expect from Ukrainian commanders if they felt that their offensive, if that's what it is, their attacks in the Bakhmut area had gone especially well. And that might correspond with some other reports which suggest that the Ukrainians have been dismayed by the extent of their losses. And I want to stress again, these are just reports. I'm not privy to the thinking of the Ukrainian staff or anything like that. But, there's been some suggestions that the Ukrainians have found the going in this attack harder than they expected, and that they're gradually adjusting towards a more defensive strategy, which could be more focused on extracting the remaining troops they still have in Bakhmut, rather than trying to reverse the flow of the battle in and around Bakhmut. Now, another thing which might strengthen that view is that Prigozhin himself has been making rather calmer statements over the last couple of hours, though I have to say that his feud with the Russian Defense Ministry continues. He says that he sent an emissary to the Russian Defense Ministry building in Moscow carrying a letter for the Russian Defense Minister, General Shoigu. He says that the staff at the Defense Ministry refused to accept the letter, and he says that he won't disclose what the content of this letter is. It's all very strange, extraordinary material stuff. I'm not going to comment further about it. I would have thought that Shoigu must be utterly furious with Prigozhin by now, and I suspect also that there would be some concern that by trying to correspond directly with Shoigu, Prigozhin is circumventing the chain of command, that there are probably officers in the area who Prigozhin should be contacting rather than Shoigu directly. After all, it was Prigozhin himself who told us just a few days ago that General Surovikin had been appointed his line manager, and one would expect that if Prigozhin had any concerns, he would be communicating them to Surovikin, if that is true, and that it would be Surovikin who would be contacting the Defense Ministry in Moscow. But anyway, look, this is more of the same drama that we're getting all the time about Prigozhin now, but overall, his comments over the last few hours have been somewhat more subdued. Of course, by the time this video goes up, both the situation on the ground and Prigozhin's responses to that situation might have changed again. There's been one indicator to me of the sheer amount of damage that Prigozhin's commentaries have caused, and that is an extraordinary article which has appeared in the Washington Post, which claims that Prigozhin contacted the Ukrainian authorities and offered to provide them with information, classified information about Russian military troop dispositions in return for a Ukrainian pullout from Bakhmut. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I do not believe this story, though I noticed with some surprise that up to this point at least, there's been no report which I have seen which has Prigozhin himself denying it. But I want to stress again, I don't believe this story. But it highlights the extent to which his public comments have created extreme dissonance within the Russian military structure, leaving it open for antagonistic parties, Ukrainian authorities, who must be, presumably, the source of this information, to try to create even more tensions between Prigozhin and the Russian Defense Ministry by basically identifying Prigozhin as a source or a potential source for information about Russian military dispositions, which would, of course, in a war situation, if it were true, amount to treason. I don't believe that this is the case, but there it is. Certainly up to this moment, the Russian authorities have taken no action in response to this story, which I suspect they don't believe. But anyway, there we go. So, a relatively stable situation on the flanks. Possible that Ukraine might have decided that this offensive, this attempted counterattack in and around Bakhmut, it's not achieved anything very much since it was launched just under a week ago, that losses have been high, both in men and machines, and that it's time to call it off. And one compelling reason why they might want to call it off is because the situation in Bakhmut itself, from a Ukrainian point of view, is deteriorating very fast. Now, I'm going to ignore Prigozhin's running commentary about what is happening in Bakhmut. He gives us information that changes all the time. Yesterday, he was reported as saying that only 1 square kilometre of territory remained under Ukrainian control. Today, it's gone up again to, I think it's 1.5 square kilometres. At one point, he was saying there was only 20 buildings that needed to be captured. Then it was 28 buildings. Yesterday, he said that the Wagner organization had captured 9 buildings, and that they were in control of 20 buildings, but that the Ukrainians were still in control of 28 buildings. It's all very confusing. And I'm going to go instead to Michael Valterson, who shows extraordinary amount of patience, I must say, trying to sift through all this information and work out exactly what's going on, but who does discuss these things with calmness and patience, and of course, as a former military person, military official, former officer in the Swedish Armed Forces, he's able to bring an expert eye to this, which I myself can't do. Anyway, he gave a lengthy tweet. Well, in fact, he did 2 lengthy tweets last night, giving updates about the fighting in Bakhmut. The first one begins rather dramatically with the words, "The nest has fallen." I have also called the entire citadel high-rise area the nest, but in Wagner vocabulary, the nest is the eastern part of the high-rise area. This is east of Levanevskovo Street. Today, the Wagner forces took 9 more high-rises. The sum is now 20 high-rises taken by Wagner forces and 28 remaining under Ukrainian control. And that presumably means buildings, 28 buildings to the west of this particular street, Levanevskovo Street. So that looks like something like 40% of this fortified area has been taken, and that the Wagner forces have been achieving a significant amount of progress in that area. And Valterson provides some very useful maps which show the progress of Russian forces, and they do give a sense that, as I said, the Wagner advance has happened quite rapidly in this area on the very western fringe now of Bakhmut. And then a short time later, he provided an even more detailed map, or rather, it wasn't he who provided it, it is apparently, well, it is another blogger called Suriyak who has provided this map, and it gives a fairly clear picture of the contested area still of the area in Bakhmut that is still contested, and essentially there's 2 remaining areas, as far as I can see, still to take. One is this roundabout, or rather it's crossroads, I should say, which I've talked about previously. That's towards the sort of northwest. It's where the Khromovo road joins and leads into Bakhmut itself. If the Wagner forces, and they're very, very close to this crossroads now, judging from this map, if they capture it, then the Khmelnitsky road is finally and conclusively closed. And then there are other areas to the southwest which still remain contested, and where most of these high-rise buildings are located. And then Valterson provided yet a further update. I believe this was early this morning. He said that some more buildings have been captured by the Russians. He says that the Semia supermarket has been captured by the Russians, but he concedes now that there's two buildings within the part of the nest, which he calls the nest, which is east of this road. He says that there's two buildings which haven't been fully captured yet. One is school number 12 and some other buildings, but he seems confident that this is all going to be resolved fairly quickly. And he says, in addition, that I believe that many of the Ukrainian soldiers in the eastern nest don't have a possibility to retreat anymore. They will have to choose between death or capture within 48 hours. The Ukrainian soldiers that still are in the southern part of the nest may still be able to retreat, but that opportunity might disappear in 24 hours. So things overall looking very grim for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. And for me, and with my inexpert eye, all I will say is that the distances now are extremely small. We're talking about a very small area of contested ground. Obviously, there are these high-rise buildings which make for strong fortifications. It seems that the Ukrainians aren't blowing them up, or alternatively, if you prefer, the Russians aren't bombing these buildings with these big 500-kilo precision-guided bombs to blow them up. There's some suggestions that this is because there are civilians in the basements of these buildings, but nonetheless, as Valterson correctly says, the Russians, the Wagner forces, have been able successfully to storm these buildings, and they're picking them off one by one. And it's clear that there is fairly rapid progress, and I'm not going to try and provide a timeline, but so far as I can see, unless there is a sudden collapse of the Russian forces on the flanks, which I don't see, then we really are now at a point where this battle has lost any meaning in terms of resistance for Ukraine. And I truly cannot understand why they're continuing to defend these positions, experiencing very high losses, including amongst some of their best troops, by doing so. So anyway, that's the information about Bakhmut. No doubt there will be more over the course of today. We will get a better sense, perhaps, over the next few hours about what the Ukrainians are indeed up to on the flanks, whether the Ukrainian offensive or counterattack has indeed run out of steam. But anyway, within Bakhmut itself, it's clear that the trend of events is very much in the Russian favor. I'm going to just finish by adding that there's been a really rather distressing article about the fighting in Bakhmut in the New York Times, based on accounts of Ukrainian soldiers who've been there. They again refer to the fighting in Bakhmut as utterly hellish, and they speak of Russian tanks operating in Bakhmut and these tanks directly firing on Ukrainian positions. Now, I should say there's also been pictures of Ukrainian tanks in Bakhmut, Some time ago, there was a report by a Russian military journalist who was in Bakhmut that there were 2 Ukrainian tanks still operating in the town. I'm going to guess that these are the same tanks that we've just seen in the latest pictures. But it's clear that the Russians do have tanks in Bakhmut and that they are causing immense damage. Now, these Russian tanks, I've come back to the conclusion that they are operated by the Russian regular army. They're providing direct fire support for the Wagner forces, which are mainly infantry. Wagner does have some artillery, but most of the artillery that is provided, artillery support that is being provided, is from the Russian regular army. And I suspect that these tanks are also Russian regular army. I said in a recent video that a picture of a T-90M tank that had been seen in Bakhmut, Russian T-90M tank that had been seen in Bakhmut, that there were some reports that it had been donated by the Russian regular military to the Wagner organization. I now think that is probably wrong, and that there's more than one Russian tank in Bakhmut, and that these are in fact, as I said, operated by the Russian regular military. So anyway, that gives one a sense of how bad things are. The New York Times report does say that the morale of the Ukrainian defenders in Bakhmut has risen after they've heard reports of these attacks by the Ukrainian military on the flanks. But I have to say, I don't think that this optimism, if such it is justified. And I certainly think that Ukraine really does need to face up to the cost, the human and material cost of what it is doing in Bakhmut, and pull its men out whilst there is still time to do so. Anyway, that's the situation in Bakhmut. There's been quite a lot of information about events on other fronts. The Russian military claimed that they'd captured another settlement in Kupiansk region. From what I can work out, this is a very small place. I doubt that that is of any particular significance. But I do get the sense that the Russians are pressing hard on Avdiivka, and I'm going to guess that once the Bakhmut situation is resolved, if it is resolved, I suspect that the Russians will focus on sorting out Avdiivka. That will be their next order of priorities after the Bakhmut area, which doesn't just include Bakhmut, but all these small villages and towns like Chasov Yar, even Konstantinovka nearby, after all of that has been finally settled. Now, that brings me to two important stories, or rather 3 important stories from my previous video. The first is about the Storm Shadow missile. The Russian Defense Ministry today claimed that they'd managed to shoot one down, that the Russian air defense was able to track a Storm Shadow and shoot it down. Don't know whether that is true or not, but that kind of information, when the Russian Defense Ministry provides it, tends to be reliable. I would tend to believe it. I think that increasingly, from this point onward, we're going to see the Russians gradually tighten their air defense against the Storm Shadow. Apparently, they already have experience of this missile used by the British during the Syrian war in the various missile strikes that the British military carried out in Syria. And I remain of the view that though this missile is certainly not to be underestimated, I think that the Russians will find ways to cope with whatever challenges it presents. The second story relates to that incident of the 4 Russian aircraft that were shot down in Bryansk region. There's been much debate and speculation and discussion as to how those aircraft were shot down. The most likely explanation that now seems to be gaining traction is that they were shot down by a Ukrainian NASAMS air defense system near the Russian border. This uses American air-to-air missiles, which have been converted into surface-to-air missiles. And the key point that is being made by some Russian commentators is that the aircraft was shot down after they'd returned from a bombing raid, and perhaps when their guard was down, in which case this might have been one of those tragic events that happens in war. There's been a long stretch of time in which the Russian Air Force has suffered no losses at all of jet fighters over the conflict, over the course of the fighting in Ukraine. That might have made, I'm afraid that is the reality, it might have made some people in the Air Force complacent, and that might have opened a window for the Ukrainians to shoot these aircraft down as they were returning to their bases. And I think that is as good an explanation as any, and it is the one that I'm going to go with. But the big news is about that big Russian missile strike on the ammunition dump in Khmelnitsky. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided no commentary about this strike at all. They've simply said that an ammunition dump in Khmelnitsky was destroyed. That's all they've said. And this doesn't come anywhere close to capturing the sheer scale of the explosion that took place when this particular ammunition dump was struck. The explosion was indeed of such intensity that I've even had some people contacting me privately and asking me whether I think a tactical nuclear device might have been used by the Russians in that area. And I'm going to say straight away that that is absolutely not the case. We would certainly know if it was a tactical nuclear device. It was no such thing. But there has been an uptick, or so some people claim, some reports say, an uptick of gamma radiation in the area. And there's now wide speculation that in this ammunition dump, there was a large number of depleted uranium shells supplied to Ukraine by Britain, and that this explosion might have generated toxic dust, and that might be spreading over the town and the countryside with all the consequences that involves. Now, in this kind of situation, one must be extremely careful not to feed rumours. I don't know what was in that ammunition dump. I've seen the reports about the spike in gamma rays or whatever it is, which might conceivably point to depleted uranium shells. I've also seen other reports that there's clear-up teams sent and that robots have been used, and all of these kind of steps have been taken by the Ukrainian authorities, which would be consistent with the story that depleted uranium shells were amongst the weapons that were destroyed in this attack on the ammunition dump. I should say that there's also additional reports that up to $500 million of munitions was destroyed in this one single ammunition dump, which does seem extraordinary, but again, I'm not sure how that figure has been calculated actually. And it wasn't just munitions, but that there were all sorts of other pieces of valuable electronic equipment and devices also there. And overall, that this was a major blow suffered by Ukraine on the eve of its offensive. Well, all I can say is this: if this ammunition dump did contain all of this material, then two things immediately come to mind. The first is that the evidence, the reports that Ukraine's air defense system has become severely depleted looks like it's true, because one would expect an ammunition dump like that to have been particularly well protected. There's no suggestion that the strike on this dump was carried out by a hypersonic Kinjal missile. So the fact that subsonic missiles, subsonic Russian missiles were able to strike it and cause this devastation shows that it was not protected by air defense systems as it should have been. That's the first thing to say. The other is that it is incredibly irresponsible, or so it seems to me, to keep all this very valuable equipment, all these munitions, and of course, if we're talking about depleted uranium shells, especially these depleted uranium shells, in a set of buildings so close to an urban centre. If you see the pictures of this explosion, you can see a metropolitan landscape all around it. This is a town, Khmelnitsky, biggish town in Ukraine, and yet somebody apparently took the decision to keep valuable materials, munitions, perhaps depleted uranium shells, other things like that, located in this building, despite knowing that it would be an obvious target for the Russian missile forces. And I have to say, that does seem to me extraordinarily irresponsible. Anyway, there are going to be more attacks of this nature. In fact, even as I'm making this program, there's more reports of Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. The Russians are obviously hunting all of these Ukrainian positions, attacking ammunition depots, oil facilities, storage facilities, assembly areas of troops, hammering away at Ukraine in advance of its offensive. In the meantime, Ukraine's president is away from his capital. He has been so to an extraordinary degree over the last few weeks. He's been in Finland, in the Netherlands, in Italy, where he attended the G7 summit in Rome. He doesn't seem to have got anything new there. He's gone to Germany, where he received the Charlemagne Prize. I discussed that in my previous video, and was informed about an arms package, which is simply, as far as I can see, a revamp of arms packages that have been promised previously, with a number tacked on, 2.7 billion euros. And he's also now in Britain, where he's meeting with Prime Minister Sunak. There's pictures of the two men embracing, and of the British promising to supply drones and agreeing to start training Ukrainian pilots for the Western fighter jets, which presumably one day the plan is Ukraine is going to get. So I would repeat again, I doubt that this is going to change the course of the war, and it might not happen anyway for quite a long time. So Zelensky himself is still on his travels. He seems remarkably unwilling to remain in Kiev for any space of time. Quite a change on his part, by the way. Previously, he stayed in Kiev and hardly left the town, the city. Now he seems to spend much of his time abroad and away from Kiev, and I wonder what it is exactly that has made him change his stance. But anyway, that's what Zelensky is doing. I don't see that it has any real relevance to what's going on the battlefronts. I do get the sense increasingly that opinion is hardening against him in the United States. These reports now that he was planning attacks on Russian oil pipelines in Russia itself, capturing Russian towns to use them as leverage against the Russians. What's most interesting about these reports is that the Americans are now publicizing them. And I can't help but think that the intention is to cast doubt, increasing amounts of doubt, on whether Zelensky is really a responsible actor in this war. Anyway, I've discussed this many times. I've discussed the arguments that are almost certainly taking place in Washington, in fact, undoubtedly are taking place in Washington, about the course of the war. I'm not going to say further, but regardless of that, the indicators are that for the moment it is not going well. That now brings me to the big news, and as I said, I'm not going to discuss the Thai election to any great length. All I will say is that this election perhaps could be chalked up as a win for the United States, or for the geopoliticians and neocons who control its policies. They have wanted to distance Thailand from China, and it seems that the people that they support have won the election. I can't add more to that. I doubt that it will change anything fundamentally in the geostrategic landscape in the Pacific, where the Chinese are becoming stronger by the day. But the election in Turkey has had, I suspect from the Western point of view, a disappointing outcome. Now, over the last couple of months, as this election has loomed, I have made known my belief that President Erdogan, more likely than not, would win the election. It's always seemed to me that he is a strong personality, a charismatic leader. He's been Turkey's leader for many, many years now. He's made Turkey almost practically a great power. He's made Turkey a country that people notice and take seriously. And it's important to say that despite the recent economic problems, which are extremely severe, nonetheless, there's been a very, very significant degree of economic development and progress in Turkey over the entire period of his rule. Nonetheless, as the election approached, it did seem that the problems that Erdogan might experience were starting to accumulate. Firstly, though inflation in Turkey has been declining, it has been declining from a stratospherically high level to what might just be called an extremely high level. A certain improvement, but hardly a dramatic improvement, in other words. So, living standards in Turkey have still been under very considerable pressure. But there's been the added problem of the Turkish earthquake, the earthquake in Syria and Turkey, which it seemed to me clearly inevitably dented Erdogan's popularity. Tens of thousands of people died. There were criticisms of the relief operation. There were criticisms of the building standards, of many of the buildings in which the people died. Erdogan's development, his economic program for Turkey has turned very heavily around construction. It seemed to me that this was almost calculated to play against him, and I suspect it did. And further than that, there have been rumours about his ill health, and there's also the sense that he's been there for a very long time, and perhaps it's time for a change. And in addition to all of that, the opposition, to a great extent, finally seemed to unite against him. And perhaps under the influence of some recent opinion polls, even I sometimes get influenced by opinion polls, it did seem to me that perhaps, just possibly, the tide of events was starting to turn against Erdogan, and that his re-election was now in doubt. Well, we've now had the first round of the election, and it now seems certain that unless there's a major upset between now and the runoff on the 28th of May, President Erdogan will be re-elected. He did much better than the opinion polls that I was talking about suggested. He won 49% of the vote, more than 49% of the vote. He only just fell short of the 50% he needed to secure re-election. His opponent, his major opponent, underperformed at about 44 to 45%. The party, the candidate who took the remaining 5%, 5 to 6% of the vote, is a candidate on the conservative nationalist side of the Turkish political divide. I would have thought that most of his voters will back Erdogan, and given how close Erdogan in the first round got to achieving the 50% that he would have needed, 50% plus one he would have needed to secure re-election in the first round, I can't imagine that he'll fail to get enough votes in the second round to put him over the line and to confirm him as president again. And it should be said also that his party also did better than I'd expected in the parliamentary elections, and with its allies, it looks set to preserve its majority in the Turkish parliament. So it looks as if Erdogan, for all the reasons I'd said previously, his charisma, his longevity, his record, complicated though it is, and of course his immense skills as a politician and his ability to frame the election as a defense by him of Turkey's independence and sovereignty and commitment to its identity, all of that, it appears to have been enough to pull him through, to enable him to position himself where his re-election on the 28th of May now looks certain. Having said that, two things need to be said. Firstly, for the moment, it looks as if the opposition are accepting these results. This is not to be definitely relied upon. It's quite likely, it's fairly possible that if Erdogan is indeed re-elected on the 28th of May, the opposition will refuse to acknowledge that fact, and we could start to see protests, and these could evolve into a colour revolution attempt. Should that happen, I think President Erdogan's grip on the institutions, on Turkey's institutions, its police, its judiciary, its civil service, its military, is now so strong that I would anticipate that colour revolution attempt to fail, and I don't believe that he's the kind of person who would be pushed aside easily through that kind of challenge. But that is a possibility that has to be borne in mind. But then the further question is, where with a Turkey with a re-elected Erdogan? Well, the first thing to say is that the Western powers over the last few weeks have made it crystal clear that they wanted Erdogan to lose. The Economist published an astonishing, in my opinion, disgraceful cover saying Erdogan must go. And it's absolutely clear, if you've been following the Western media, that they have been rooting for his defeat. Certainly many people in Turkey think so, and it's been heavily used by Erdogan's supporters in the Turkish media. And by the way, I think that it was an important factor in consolidating support for Erdogan in the election. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing I want to say about this Western campaign to try to push Erdogan out through this election, especially if it is followed by a colour revolution attempt over the next few weeks, is that assuming that Erdogan wins on the 28th of May, which, as I said, barring a massive upset, looks all but certain, and assuming that he's able to weather whatever colour revolution attempt is attempted against him, which I also expect, well, then I can't help but think that that is further going to alienate not just Erdogan himself, but Turkey from the Western powers, and push it closer into integration with the Eurasian powers, China and Russia. Now, this has been the trend for roughly a decade, and I think this election looks likely to accelerate it. I don't think it needed to go this way. I think Erdogan is a difficult and complex man, but I think that his attitudes and feelings reflect those of his country. Turkey has been taken for granted by the West for a very long time, and many Turks have gradually come to resent that, and have resented the way in which the Western-dominated establishment has exercised power in Turkey, and at the way in which Turkey itself has been used by the Western powers in their various geopolitical games. And you can see this in the dramatic shift in Turkish public opinion which has taken place in my lifetime. You travelled to Turkey in, say, late 1970s. At that time, Turkish public opinion was, in my experience, strongly pro-Western overall, very, very critical of Russia, which after all is the ancestral adversary against which Turkey has fought and, by the way, largely lost many wars. Today, the mood in Turkey has almost completely reversed. Turkish public opinion tends to favour good relations with Russia and has become very antagonistic towards the United States. And it's not therefore just Erdogan who is starting to distance Turkey from the United States. In doing so, and the West, in doing so, he's simply going along with the overall drift of opinion amongst his people. This election is going to intensify that process. It's going to make many people in Turkey feel even further that the West doesn't take Turkey seriously and wants to see Turkey once again brought under Western control as some kind of satellite country to which the Western powers feel condescending towards. Well, if so, all I can say is that this is perhaps the single greatest mistake amongst so many others Western policy has made in this part of the world. To be very clear, if Turkey does indeed eventually come to changing sides entirely, if it were to quit NATO, I'm not saying it will, but if it were, and we're closer to that point than we've ever been, and join the Eurasian Union, if we look at Turkey's population, its size, its military capacity, all of those things, it would be a bigger blow for NATO, in my opinion, than whatever gain NATO achieved through the incorporation of the former Warsaw Pact countries in Eastern Europe into the NATO system. Well, that's me for the day. We'll see how things turn out in Ukraine. We'll see whether the Ukrainians do more in and around Bakhmut, what else happens on the battlefronts, whether this Ukrainian offensive is going to be launched any time soon, or if not, to which date it's been postponed to. And of course, we'll see what else happens in Turkey over the next few days. But that's me for the day. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also find all sorts of amazing things in our shop: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, rucksacks, bottles, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.